Good morning again, Bethel. So I'm going to start us off here with our, as David said, there's going to be three of us, so I'm the first. Some might say the better, but no, we're not going to do that. So I guess the first question is, what even is the UCC General Synod anyway? Wikipedia explains General Synod as the national decision-making body for the denomination, responsible for giving general direction to the evangelistic, missionary, and justice programs of the UCC. Because the UCC holds an explicitly congregational polity, though, any decisions made by the Synod are not binding upon the UCC's congregations or its associations or conferences in any way, though the national offices and the UCC Constitution and bylaws expect serious consideration to be given them. The Synod is responsible for authorizing budgets and electing board members for the covenanted ministries, formerly known as the instrumentalities of the UCC. Those agencies have evolved over the years from a number of separate entities with different organizational structures into a more coordinated configuration in order to serve the denomination more efficiently. The Synod usually makes pronouncements and passes resolutions on social and political issues, judged to be of concern by delegates as well. Most, if not all, have historically reflected liberal theological and political perspectives, including support for civil rights, feminism, environmentalism, and the rights for homosexuals. But if you ask me, and I guess in a way you kind of have, I'd be hard pressed to say that being a delegate at the General Synod 34 was nothing less than amazing. It was an honor to represent Bethel, both as a witness to our faith and to the church body being the hands and feet of Christ. I have fond memories of my time at Synod, and it was difficult not being overcome with emotion during our final worship service. I simply didn't want it to end. I had made friends. I was empowered to go forth and get into the good trouble set forth by the work of the delegates on the plenary floor. The work of over 700 people whom over the course of a few days came together despite our differences to advocate for the needs and concerns of our siblings in Christ in communities both on a local level and also on globally as well. It was historical. The resolutions brought forth by the committees were thoughtful and meaningful, such as affirming guns to gardens and other gun violence prevention ministries, which supports churches and all other settings of the UCC to engage in meaningful action to address the scourge of gun violence in our country. A resolution supporting public school educators, academic freedom, and equity efforts in schools. This resolution is intended to voice support for public school educators, academic freedom, and equity efforts in schools at a time when public education is threatened through attempts to control curriculum, ban books and media, and restrict strategies to ensure the advancement of equity. Actively affirming the human dignity of transgender and non-binary persons. The United Church of Christ has staked its claim to be a diverse community of believers and belief. It is our diversity that creates our strength. This diversity calls us to a radical welcome and to widen the table of welcome to our transgender and non-binary siblings. This one, a resolution calling on the United Church of Christ local churches to witness a white supremacy-free zone and confronting white supremacy. Yes, absolutely. This resolution calls on local churches of the United Church of Christ of predominantly European descent and UCC local churches in general to declare themselves, their communities, and settings as a white supremacy-free zone, and to publicly express that we are confronting white supremacy through declaration, intentional study, and action. This is just a brief synopsis of the behind-the-scenes work that took place at General Synod. And I'm hopeful and excited about the prospects of continuing to be the hands and feet of Christ and exemplifying what it means to belong to a faith that is over 2,000 years old, but proving that our thinking is not. UCC General Synod 35, the next one in 2025, there we go, is slated to be in Kansas City, Missouri. So I guess what I need to say is, Kansas City, here I come. Thank you.
So you heard from the delegate. So now you get to hear from the guests that went. So I like to tell people that I went that I was just the emotional support person and the person that carried the bags. So making all things new was the theme of this General Synod. When I walked into the convention center, I was welcomed with a sight of a garden of creation for the stage. Reverend Cheryl Lindsay, the UCC Minister of Worship and Theology, drew an idea of what she was hoping and gave it to Reverend Alexander Childs, who brought it to life. The stage consists of 201 plants, a live edge slab of a black walnut tree used as the altar, held up by stumps of oak and pine. There were rocks, mushrooms representing the kingdom of fungi, and woodland creatures such as weasels and red-headed ducks, an Amazon tree frog, long-eared owls, a red fox, a hedgehog, and a bunny that all moved, and they moved these magnificent creatures each day to keep people on their feet. The cross on the stage was edged with direct glass to make it glow. The wood on the cross was Iraq wood from Western Africa, and it's the same wood used to create the original altar table that graced the national settings at the Amistad Chapel for more than 30 years. Upon this stage, in this garden, we begin the opening worship. As this was the first in-person synod since 2019, a crowd of close to 2,000 gathered to usher in the presence of the Holy Spirit. With music that fed our mind, body, and spirit, opening speaker Jamar Dole, President and CEO of the UCC Council for Health and Human Services Ministries, began with a question: how good is it to meet in person? He continued, we know that COVID has forced us to learn new ways to gather together, incorporate new technologies into our churches and into our ministries. Dole started his sermon with a call to reflect on the meaning of the theme for this year's General Synod, making all things new, taken from Isaiah 43. He walked the crowd through 3 steps of transformation, comparing the church's journey today with that of the nation of Israel as they escaped bondage in Egypt. I'm not going to go through all 3 steps because of time, but I would implore you to go to the website and read about the opening worship. But a powerful statement he made that will stick with me is acknowledging that while the UCC is trying to move forward, we often get bogged down with the traditions of the past. Listening to the voices of dead people, he asked, can we be surprised that the churches are dwindling if we are continuing to listen to the voices that maybe are no longer in tune with what God is trying to do? This is when many of us go on autopilot, Dole noted. He called them cruise control Christians. Don't even realize that this disconnect has happened, but yet they want to tell others in the church what we can and cannot do based on what we have always done. This, Dole said, is when we need to evaluate and examine our own bias and privileges and call for the crowd to get comfortable with holy discomfort. This was just the opening worship. Sunday was just as powerful. The Reverend Carmen Landau, moderator of the United Church of Canada, and also the first Indigenous woman to leave a Canadian denomination, offered a sermon with a vision of reclamation and centering on marginalized communities amid a context where our children are being born into a world of horrors. She spoke to the broad impact of colonization as a member of the Halsuk Nation, and forgive me if I pronounced that wrong, the history of her people. She challenged people in the room, especially those middle-class, educated, comfortable whiteness, to listen to more marginalized people and just believe them. She went on to say, the atonement to fear is when we are rooted in love. We cannot keep from building community, from participating in equity and justice. We cannot keep from standing up for our siblings and saying, not in my name, not in the name of God. We cannot help from building relationships that have space for vulnerability and trust and respect. That when we hurt each other, because we are human and we will hurt each other, we have to live in fear because we don't have to live in fear because we have forgiveness. Then we got to the final worship, with a service that urged worshipers to go forth from Indianapolis and echo the Synod theme, making all things new. The final speaker underscored that with a message of recreation and revolution. In his sermon, the Reverend J.J. Flagg, Associate Minister of Pastoral Care and Justice at Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, called on participants to renew their covenant with each other and look for ways to change the world. He emotionally recounted his own faith journey and his discovery that the book of Revelation was a book of revolution. Whether you want a revolution or not, it is here, Flagg said. When he talked about God is still speaking, when we talk about making all things new, we are engaging in a revolutionary talk. Flagg, a member of the board of the UCC Disabilities Ministry, said that before hearing the song by Kirk Franklin, Are You Ready for a Revolution?, the only message he had gotten from the book of Revelation was of rapture and being left behind, having to fight the Antichrist. Delivering his sermon while seated in a wheelchair, Flagg said, God forbid I would be left behind, because the truth is, I can't run. The song, he said, opened his eyes to seeing not only that there could be bad theology, but it was often death-dealing theology. The kind of theology that tells you that there are some parts of you that are not welcome at the table. In his closing, he challenged each person at the Synod to go and turn the world upside down. Now, General Synod just was not about adults, but there were also youth there. Youth had a chance to interact with UCC leaders by asking questions of them, but the leaders asked questions of the youth and they listened to them because we need the youth aspect. Youth had a chance to give their point of view. One youth had a safe space, and she shared. She was so greeted at the last Synod that she came to by pride flags and pins that she had the courage to come out to her mother on her way home from the airport after the gathering. They devoted some of their scheduled time there to focus on houselessness and food insecurities. They had 2 simulations where they set up for the youth, one being where they found all the items on a list that they would need if they were unhoused, such as a bus pass, a bed and a shelter, identification, food, and clothing. A second simulation they did was work virtually to purchase enough food for a family of 5 for a week with a limited amount of money, which usually amounts to having less than $2 to spend per person, per meal, per day using SNAP. All of this was to help them build empathy. The AIDS Memorial Quilt was part of the National AIDS Memorial Display, colorful quilted panels in back of the exhibit hall. And let's see, can I get this to work to share it with you? And that was the Garden of Creation that I meant to share with you earlier. So the AIDS Memorial Quilt was part of the National AIDS Memorial Display. They offer visual memorials to many of those lives lost to AIDS. Reverend Joseph Shoregrass, a member of the United Church of Christ HIV and AIDS Network, stated, "It has been 41 years since the first diagnosis of someone having what would become known as HIV or AIDS. In 1987, the very first quilt was sewn in San Francisco, and by the end of that year, they had 6,000 panels already. Sections of the memorial quilt, nearly 50,000 panels, which included the names of more than 105,000 people who lost their lives to AIDS, are regularly displayed throughout the world. The display at Synod included 10 blocks, each 12 by 12 foot. I want people to remember that it's not over yet. People are still dying," Shoregrass said. "I work in a hospital, and I still see patients with AIDS dying in this day and age with all the medications, because the medications don't work for everyone. Some people don't have the mental capability to be compliant with their meds, and in other countries, meds are not available. In some countries, for somebody to get sick, they can't say anything there because to be gay is a death penalty." Along with AIDS memorial quilts, a series of 12 panels were displayed with the final words of George Floyd. Originated at the United Church of Joffrey, New Hampshire, and created by parishioners from 9 New Hampshire churches, the fabric artwork formed a narrative of Floyd's last moments that afternoon in Minneapolis, with the hope that they further the conversation about how anti-Black violence impacts communities. In addition to Floyd, other familiar faces can be seen on the quilts, including Tamar Rice, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. This was also displayed with a film, and it was set up for a sacred conversation around race. And you can also go on the website that's in the highlights and see this also. Now, the business of the church was not just held inside of the walls of the convention center. The UCC advocated prayer on the grounds of the Indiana State Capitol, and a welcoming visual at the ICE office where Reverend Linda Jaramillo, former UCC executive of Justice and Witness Ministries, said that we cannot let US policies that are not immigrant welcoming go to the Supreme Court, but need to address them in our own communities and halls. "I cannot help but take it personally, and we all have to take it personally," said Jaramillo. "As immigrants welcoming people, let's pay attention to what is happening in our own communities." In 2021, Senate approves a resolution that declared that racism was a public health crisis. Based on the racial disparities that came to light during the pandemic, Task Force Chair Yvette Nguyen and Associate General Minister Reverend Tracy Blackman described what had been accomplished since then. An ongoing acknowledgement of the history of racism in the church and its impact on the church, Nguyen said the UCC board, with the help of Council of Conference Ministers, created the task force and solicited a diverse group of members. From hundreds of applicants, 14 people were chosen. The task force hired Culture Brokers, a minority-owned consulting firm with expertise in this area. It worked with the UCC Center for Analytics, Research and Development and Data to gather information through focus groups and customized racial audit survey distributed to 800 members. The results were reviewed by cultural brokers and shared with the task force to identify areas of strength and weaknesses, challenges and opportunities within the national setting. The task force then worked to develop an equity strategic plan, identifying steps that would have the greatest impact over the next 12 to 18 months. Assigning implementation dates, the UCC board has approved the draft plan and the documents will be available within its finalization. Now, the UCC, we are good about acknowledging when we mess up. Last fall, the UCC Historical Council officially named the Afro-Christian Convention as one of the 5 major streams traditions that form the church, joining the already acknowledged congregational, Christian, evangelical, and Reformed traditions. Reverend Yvonne Delk, who at General Synod in 1989 became the first woman ever nominated to lead the denomination, delivered the keynote on the Afro-Christian Convention. She spoke as an elder in the village, as she addressed racism as a flaw in the soul of this nation. The outgoing General Minister and President, Reverend John Dornhauer, shared at the United Black Christian Luncheon that without the Afro-Christian Convention as its 5th stream, we cannot be the UCC. He offered a full apology for the UCC cutting off one of its limbs and for making you wait this long for this. Delk traced the embodiment of the Afro-Christian tradition from 1619 to the 1950s and into the present context. She reminded the audience that this tradition has historically only been recognized as a footnote to the 4 white streams of the United Church of Christ, and that the UCC has lived the flaw of seeing the Afro-Christian Convention as an object of the ministry instead of the subject defining the UCC. She highlighted the wisdom of you got to push it to do right, as she challenged her audience that they cannot rest because there is more pushing to do. She expressed her appreciation for Dornhauer's apology, but she pushed for an apology at a bigger mic, because apologies in the closet are not acceptable. The next afternoon, that's exactly what happened. He stood in front of the Garden of Creation and delivered the same apology to almost 3,000 people. He also said, I grieve that now, having celebrated our 66th anniversary, 3 generations of United Church of Christ children have gone through confirmation being told that there were only 4 streams present at our birthing. Dornhauer spoke to the assembly. There were always 5. He asserted that the absence was a white supremacist rewriting of our history and called the exclusion of this stream from its rightful place along the other traditions a sin. On behalf of the United Church of Christ and to the leaders active in and descended from the Afro-Christian stream of our beloved faith, and in recognition of the sin of centering whiteness, I hereby issue an apology for my and our complicity in and with the manifestation of white privilege that motivated some of us to set the table without you, Dornhauer said. We as a church don't always get it right, but when we learn better, we do better.
So batting cleanup, you've heard from a delegate and you've heard from a visitor, and well, I'll just tell you the story. General Synod, for me, is a family reunion, a wonderful joining of learning, discussion, worship, service. It is emotional, it is idea stretching, spiritual, and invigorating experience. Each one is different. As will all families, there are some times of tension and disagreement, but the predominant emotion is joy. My experience at Synod this time was all that, plus an entirely different view than I had ever experienced in prior Synod. When I registered for Synod back in January, it had been my intention to go as just a visitor, to enjoy reconnecting with old friends without formal responsibilities. By April, my Synod experience would change dramatically, but more on that later. I want to spend just a few minutes giving you a glimpse into some of the key events of Synod not already spoken about by my sisters, Nikki and Mo. This Synod was groundbreaking as we elected a new general minister and president of the United Church of Christ and said goodbye to our outgoing general minister and president, John Dorhauer. Now you say, well, haven't we always periodically elected a general minister and president over the years? Yes, but as has been mentioned, for the first time, we elected a woman, a person of color, and an immigrant. The Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson is a dynamic leader, preacher, teacher, and poet. Karen Georgia, and I caution you, if you ever meet her, you need to use both those names, don't call her Karen. Karen Georgia brings many years of experience in leadership as the Associate General Minister of Wider Church Ministries, Operations, and co-executive of Global Ministries that we do in partnership with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Included in these responsibilities was also being Synod Administrator. Karen Georgia is a Holy Spirit-filled poet, visionary, yet a realist, a mom, a grandma, and much more. Let's hear Karen Georgia as she speaks to a group gathered during Synod to meet the candidate.
There's an institutional culture that says this is the way we're supposed to do it. And if we're not doing it this way, then we're not successful. And if we're not doing it this way, then these people have to be excluded. So when we begin to look beyond our institutional machinations and begin to really think about what it means to invite the Spirit to be present among us and moving in particular ways that are beyond our imagination, we will begin to see a different type of church, right? The body of Christ is something that we talk about, like it's over here on a shelf somewhere, right? But it's actually dynamic, changing, transforming, moving, growing, right? And as I said last night, the church of 1957 cannot be who we are today. 66 years. Can we seriously do the same thing for 66 years and measure that as success? No. So when we talk about the institutional church, we really have to think about how that has shifted, changed, and we really ought to stop talking about the church of the 21st century, because I want to tell you that this is 2023. We are almost a quarter of a century in, people. Okay? So how do we begin to reimagine? And it's unfortunate that it was COVID that really pushed us, right? It took crisis to push us to reimagining what church could be.
Friends, we are in good hands. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the keynote speakers that we had at Synod. Unlike actual worship, pastors providing sermons, these individuals provided us with a great deal to think about, a great deal of inspiration, and calls to action. So the first speaker was Nadia Boltz-Weber. I would encourage you to Google any one of these people that I'm going to talk about, because they're each individually amazing. And I'm going to be sharing just a few quotes from each one. Our hope is not in the Dow Jones, in the government, in the for-profit industrial complex, but in the God of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Isaiah, Mary Magdalene, and Mother Teresa. When we stand on the rock of this big story with one hand reaching back to the hope of the prophets and one hand reaching forward to the promises of God, we can stand firmly in the reality of the present, not to have that reality consume us. One person asked Bolz-Weber how she manages to hold on to hope when her anxiousness is palpable. She says, I sometimes have to borrow other people's hope, other people's faith. Sometimes we are the one lowering our friend through the roof to Jesus, and sometimes we're the ones being lowered. Our second keynote speaker was Ibram Kendi, and many of you may be familiar with him from his book titled Becoming an Anti-Racist, or How to Be an Anti-Racist. He had a lot to say about that and our whole focus on becoming an anti-racist church, but I want to spend a moment talking about what he mentioned. He was asked because the day that he gave his presentation was the day the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action. And he had a lot to say about that. He said, the rollback of affirmative action is the new separate but equal. Racism is now reinforced by big business when we fight with tunnel vision. So what does Dr. Kendi suggest we do? We have to build solidarity across issues. It's critical that we need to work together, people of color, LGBTQIA+, disabilities, and women. We can't work in silos. Our last speaker was Brian Stevenson. Have any of you seen the movie Just Mercy? Several of you have. It's really powerful if you haven't seen it. And it was based on a book by Brian Stevenson, who is a justice attorney, an author, and some of the key things that he brought up in his presentation was that a narrative that justifies injustice is the thing we need to dismantle. We need to be in proximity to those experiencing injustice. Truth-telling needs to come before reconciliation. You can't skip that step. And we need to be in the proximity of injustice to take action. Justice is not a passive activity. We have to be hopeful to believe in things we have not seen. So in addition to being fed by all these amazing people, it was also an opportunity for us to serve within the confines of the convention center as well as out. Did you know that menstrual supplies are not covered by SNAP? It's absolutely a crime. This project was done in conjunction with an organization called Church World Service, and we put together just random people from Synod that walked in the room that chose to participate, over 3,100 what they call period packs. It was a combination of hygiene and menstrual supplies. And honestly, I had not given a lot of thought to menstrual justice before this, and it just really brought it all into stark focus. And the sad part is 3,100 period packs are not even going to dent the surface. So I was really pleased when I came back from Synod to hear that our food cupboard addresses this as best we can. And so, yay, Bethel. Okay, just some basic stuff. Nikki mentioned that we did elections. So what happens when Synod isn't in session? There is a board of directors that manages the business of the church in between synods. And they kind of mind the store, if you will. But ultimately, Synod is the deciding group of people. The nominating committee of the UCC is responsible for taking care of the nominations for individuals to serve on the board of directors, and also the Synod moderator and assistant moderator. And this occurs, and this is recommended to the Synod for a vote. So the new nominating committee members were voted on, the board of directors, the moderator, and the assistant moderator. And right now, the terms are changing because, as we said earlier, the timing of Synod is changing because Synod is really expensive. And it's really a lot of time spent. And there's been wanting to be aware of and be sensitive to that. So after 2025, General Synod will now be only every 3 years instead of every 2. So, like I said, there are elections, and when my life changed, I was elected to become the assistant moderator of the next Synod. So I told you that earlier that my experience with Synod changed between January and April, and I hadn't even gone there yet. I served on the National Nominating Committee, and the person who is currently chair is June Boutwell, and you all know June or have met June. And June asked me to have lunch with her one day last April. She said, I'm coming over, I got to pick up stuff from my accountant, and would you like to have lunch? I was like, okay. So we went and just were chit-chatting, and she said, oh, did you see the UCC News Digest today? It's like, no, not yet. She said, well, have a look at it, because we have a little problem. And what the problem was, the person who had been recommended to be assistant moderator nominee had to, for personal reasons, decline the role. And so what the leadership for moderating of the plenary sessions for all the business that Nikki talked about, they alternate a clergy person with a lay person. So the incoming moderator is a clergy person, Rushan Sinadure, and they needed a lay person. And I said, oh wow, that's really a bummer, and we just kept on with our lunch. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and there was a little something. And the next day I got up and was thinking some more about it, and it was like, oh, okay. So I dusted off my church resume and sent it in. So for the next 2 years, in addition to serving actively in Kansas City, in preparation for that, my colleague Rushan and I will be co-chairing the Program and Planning Committee for the General Synod. And also we have seats on the UCC Board of Directors. So this is not just a show up and do it kind of thing. You got to kind of live into it. And in addition, as a full voting member of the Board of Directors, I will also have committee assignments as well. So it'll be a big deal. You will see me, and I'll probably have my hair on fire from time to time. But I would really appreciate your prayers, because I stand before you incredibly humbled by this task, and ask that you support me in prayers, and for all of the leadership of the United Church of Christ as we try to live into what God is calling us to be.